In the labyrinth of life, where chaos reigns and uncertainty looms large, there exists a beacon of unwavering resolve and inner tranquility. It is the ancient philosophy of Stoicism, a timeless guide to navigating the tumultuous waters of existence with grace and fortitude. Join us on a journey into the heart of Stoic wisdom, where we shall unearth the secrets to conquering stress and anxiety in our everyday lives. Imagine a ship sailing through treacherous seas, buffeted by fierce winds and towering waves. In such dire circumstances, the fate of the vessel rests not on the whims of fate, but on the skill and resilience of its crew. So too, in the voyage of life, we must cultivate the virtues of Stoicism to weather the storms that assail us. At the core of Stoic philosophy lies the principle of acceptance of the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. This timeless maxim, articulated by the Stoic sage Epictetus, serves as a guiding light in times of adversity. For it is only by embracing the inevitability of life's trials that we can find the strength to overcome them. Consider the story of Marcus Aurelius, the revered Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher. Despite facing constant challenges and external threats to his reign, Marcus remained steadfast in his commitment to virtue and inner tranquility. In his seminal work, Meditations, he offers timeless wisdom on the art of mastering one's emotions and cultivating a sense of inner peace amidst the chaos of the world. Our actions may be impeded, but there can be no impeding our intentions or dispositions, Marcus writes. Because we can accommodate and adapt. The mind adapts and converts to its own purposes the obstacle to our acting. Indeed, in the face of adversity, it is not the circumstances themselves that determine our fate, but rather our response to them. By cultivating a Stoic mindset, one marked by resilience, self-discipline, and a commitment to virtue, we can transform even the most daunting challenges into opportunities for growth and self-improvement. But Stoicism is not merely a philosophy of endurance, it is also a philosophy of empowerment. By embracing the Stoic virtues of wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, we can unlock our true potential as leaders and agents of change in the world. Consider the example of Cato the Younger, the famed Stoic statesman who stood unwavering in the face of tyranny and corruption. Despite facing immense pressure to compromise his principles, Cato remained true to his Stoic values, ultimately sacrificing his own life rather than betraying his ideals. In the life of a man, his time is but a moment, his being an incessant flux, his senses a dim rushlight, his body a prey of worms, his soul an unquiet eddy, his fortune dark, and his fame doubtful, Cato once remarked. In short, all that is of the body is as coursing waters, all that is of the soul as dreams and vapors. In a world plagued by moral ambiguity and ethical compromise, Stoicism offers a beacon of moral clarity and unwavering resolve. By anchoring ourselves in the timeless principles of Stoic philosophy, we can cultivate the courage to stand firm in our convictions, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. But Stoicism is not merely a philosophy for individuals, it is also a philosophy for leaders. In an age marked by uncertainty and upheaval, effective leadership requires more than just charisma or authority, it requires moral integrity and a steadfast commitment to the common good. Consider the example of Seneca, the renowned Stoic philosopher and advisor to the Roman Emperor Nero. Despite occupying a position of immense power and influence, Seneca remained true to his Stoic principles, using his wisdom and insight to counsel Nero towards justice and virtue. True happiness is to enjoy the present, without anxious dependence upon the future, not to amuse ourselves with either hopes or fears but to rest satisfied with what we have, which is sufficient, Seneca once wrote. In the turbulent realm of politics and governance, Stoicism offers a roadmap for ethical leadership, one marked by integrity, humility, and a commitment to the greater good. By following in the footsteps of Stoic leaders like Seneca, we can inspire others to greatness and foster a culture of excellence and virtue in our organizations and communities. But perhaps the greatest lesson of Stoicism lies not in its lofty ideals or philosophical principles, but in its practical application to everyday life. In the hustle and bustle of modern existence, where stress and anxiety reign supreme, Stoicism offers a sanctuary of inner peace and tranquility. Consider the Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum, or the contemplation of adversity. By mentally preparing ourselves for life's inevitable trials and tribulations, we can inoculate ourselves against the debilitating effects of stress and anxiety. Instead of being caught off guard by adversity, we can greet it with equanimity and resilience, knowing that we possess the inner strength to endure. Moreover, Stoicism teaches us to embrace the power of perspective, to view life's challenges not as insurmountable obstacles, but as opportunities for growth and self-discovery. By reframing our perceptions and adopting a Stoic mindset, we can transform even the most daunting challenges into stepping stones on the path to greatness. In the words of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them. By mastering our perceptions and cultivating a sense of inner tranquility, we can free ourselves from the shackles of fear and anxiety, and embark on a journey towards true fulfillment and self-actualization. But perhaps the greatest gift of Stoicism lies in its ability to cultivate a sense of gratitude and appreciation for the present moment. In a world consumed by materialism and consumerism, Stoicism offers a refreshing antidote, a reminder to savor the simple pleasures of life and to cherish the moments we hold dear. As the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once remarked, very little is needed to make a happy life, it is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. By cultivating a spirit of gratitude and contentment, we can find joy and fulfillment in even the most mundane aspects of existence, and live our lives with a sense of purpose and meaning. In conclusion, Stoicism offers a timeless guide to navigating the complexities of the human condition with grace and resilience. By embracing the Stoic virtues of wisdom, courage, and temperance, we can cultivate a sense of inner peace and tranquility amidst the chaos of the world. And by applying the timeless principles of Stoic philosophy to our everyday lives, we can unlock our true potential as leaders and agents of change in the world. So let us heed the wisdom of the Stoic sages, and embark on a journey towards self-mastery and enlightenment. For in the words of the Stoic philosopher Seneca, we are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality. By mastering our fears and embracing the power of Stoic philosophy, we can conquer stress and anxiety, and live our lives with courage, resilience, and inner peace. In the tempest of life, where the winds of uncertainty howl and the waves of adversity crash, Stoicism stands as a beacon of resilience and tranquility. Drawing upon the timeless wisdom of Stoic philosophers and the stories of those who embodied its principles, we embark on a journey to explore how Stoic philosophy equips us to conquer stress and anxiety, and emerge stronger amidst life's challenges. Embracing adversity. The Stoics believed in the power of acceptance, not resignation, but a courageous acknowledgement of reality as it is. One of the most famous Stoic philosophers, Epictetus, emphasized the importance of distinguishing between what is within our control and what is not. In his discourses, he advises us to focus our efforts only on what we can influence, and to accept with equanimity that which lies beyond our control. Consider the story of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whose reign was beset by constant warfare and political intrigue. Despite the chaos that surrounded him, Marcus remained steadfast in his commitment to Stoic principles, finding solace and strength in his inner citadel of virtue. His Meditations, a collection of personal reflections, offers profound insights into the Stoic approach to life, encouraging us to embrace adversity as an opportunity for growth and self-improvement. Cultivating inner resilience. Stoicism teaches us to cultivate a sense of inner resilience, to withstand the storms of life with fortitude and grace. The Stoic philosopher Seneca, in his letters to Lucilius, offers practical advice on how to cultivate resilience in the face of adversity. He advises us to train ourselves to endure hardship with patience and dignity, recognizing that true strength lies not in the absence of suffering, but in our ability to endure it with courage and grace. Consider the example of the Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, who endured exile and persecution for his beliefs. Despite facing immense hardship, Musonius remained steadfast in his commitment to Stoic principles, finding solace in the knowledge that his suffering was an opportunity for spiritual growth. His teachings on the importance of virtue and self-discipline continue to inspire countless individuals to this day. Harnessing the power of perspective. Stoicism teaches us to harness the power of perspective, to view life's challenges not as obstacles, but as opportunities for growth and self-discovery. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, in his Enchiridion, emphasizes the importance of cultivating a mindset of resilience and adaptability. He advises us to reframe our perceptions of adversity, recognizing that it is not the events themselves that cause us suffering, but our interpretation of them. Consider the story of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus himself, who was born into slavery and faced numerous hardships throughout his life. Despite his humble origins, Epictetus rose to prominence as one of the most revered Stoic philosophers of his time, embodying the principles of resilience and inner strength. His teachings on the importance of maintaining control over our thoughts and perceptions continue to resonate with readers around the world. Leading with virtue. Stoicism is not merely a philosophy for individuals, it is also a philosophy for leaders. In an age marked by uncertainty and upheaval, effective leadership requires more than just charisma or authority, it requires moral integrity and a steadfast commitment to the common good. Consider the example of the Stoic statesman Cato the Younger, who stood unwavering in the face of tyranny and corruption. Despite facing immense pressure to compromise his principles, Cato remained true to his Stoic values, ultimately sacrificing his own life rather than betraying his ideals. His unwavering commitment to virtue and justice serves as a timeless example of Stoic leadership in action. Stoicism offers a timeless guide to navigating the complexities of the human condition with grace and resilience. By embracing the Stoic virtues of acceptance, resilience, and perspective, we can cultivate a sense of inner peace and tranquility amidst the chaos of the world. And by applying the timeless principles of Stoic philosophy to our everyday lives, we can unlock our true potential as leaders and agents of change in the world. So let us heed the wisdom of the Stoic sages, and embark on a journey towards self-mastery and enlightenment. For in the words of the Stoic philosopher Seneca, we are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality. By mastering our fears and embracing the power of Stoic philosophy, we can conquer stress and anxiety, and live our lives with courage, resilience, and inner peace. If you found value in this exploration of Stoic wisdom and its applications in navigating life's challenges, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. By joining our community, you'll have access to regular updates and insights to help you cultivate resilience, inner strength, and purpose in your own life. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to sharing this journey with you.